When I think back on this experience, it seems like something completely surreal that couldn't possibly have happened. But listening to some of the other things I hear on this channel reminds me that I'm not crazy. I grew up in Kentucky on a horse breeding farm, so my love of horses runs deep. When I was out of high school, I knew that I wanted to pursue something that involved working with those horses. A lot of my friends wanted to go into veterinary medicine, but that didn't sound right for me. I knew I wanted to work in more of an outdoor setting. I decided to take a year off before starting college, and while I was traveling around the country, I came across something that sounded perfect for me. I was visiting Yosemite National Park and found out they had mounted park rangers. It sounded like a dream come true to ride horses around most of the day. I ended up taking the coursework to become a law enforcement ranger, and then eventually I was able to get a position at Yosemite as a mounted patrol ranger. Since I had extensive experience with horses, a big part of my job involved caring for them and training them. It was great as I thought it would be. The horses are involved in a lot of different aspects of the park, especially law enforcement and search and rescue. Some of them are also used in educational programs. Also, visitors can hire some of them for backcountry riding. My days started really early, usually around 6 a.m. I would have to get there early to groom them and feed them. They would usually be looking out for me and expecting their measure of oats and their flakes of hay. A flake of hay is just what we call a portion of the bale. The portions are measured out so that we know how much they're getting. One morning, I was half asleep, and I went out to fling hay over the fences. I got surprised by the sound of geese flapping around the horse trough. I had never seen them over there before, so I wasn't expecting all of that honking and flapping first thing. I had to take a quick pause to gather myself while I kept tossing the hay. For the first time, I noticed the horses hadn't come toward me to get that hay that they were usually whining for. They were just staying huddled together under the shelter. I went over to the gate so that I could go inside and check on them. The gate latch had been getting rusty, so I had been securing it with a piece of wire. But I saw that the wire was missing, and the gate was open about an inch, as if something had gained access. That really had me worried because there was no way someone would have come out there earlier than me. I went over to the horses to give them some nose rubs, which they usually love, but I could see that they were feeling pretty nervous. I had brought the oats in with me and held out some in my hand, but the horses wouldn't touch it. Weirdly, the geese were still hanging around out by the horses' water trough. I couldn't understand what they were doing in the horse corral. I started feeling a little creeped out. I went back out of the gate and started looking around, and my eyes caught some movement. It looked like something detached itself from the landscape behind the stables. I saw this huge thing appear. It had a very large head that, I kid you not, reminded me of a dinosaur. No hair, just a big lizardy head. It was standing on two legs. It turned toward me and looked right at me. It had these reptilian yellow eyes. All I remember about its face were the eyes and these sharp teeth. Like I said, I was standing upright, and it was probably about 6 or 7 feet tall. I was about 30 feet away from it, and it was hard to tell, but it looked like it had grayish, scaly skin. When it locked eyes on me, it reacted. It kind of shifted, or like took a little step to the side, like it was surprised that I had seen it. This feeling of fear and dread washed over me, and it was paralyzing. I can still feel the feeling of my heart beating like crazy in my chest. I've never felt fear like that in my life since. I also felt a heaviness in my head. I don't know how to describe it any other way. The thing felt evil. After being immobilized by fear for what seemed like forever, but was probably only about 10 seconds, I turned and ran back to the horses. I would have run the hell away from there, but my first instinct was to protect the animals. As soon as I did that, it turned and ran up the hill, faster than anything I've ever seen. I eventually sounded the alarm and some other rangers showed up. They wanted to follow after it on horseback, but the horses wouldn't go. I'd never seen them disobey like that, and they wouldn't eat for hours after that. I could not imagine what that thing wanted. It couldn't have been after the oats and the hay. When I thought about the possibility that it had gotten in the gate and gone near them, I just felt sick. But I looked them over really carefully, and they seemed physically unharmed. We started locking the horses inside the stable at night after that. Of course, when I went to make my report, they tried to get me to think I saw a mountain lion or something, but no effing way was that a normal creature. This is embarrassing, but we should probably get it out of the way. It's important to the story, I think. I used to go by Monster Bone 75. I realize now that it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. I've since changed my username. If you were a part of any online cryptid forums in the mid to late 2000s, though, you might recognize that name. You might remember seeing Monster Bone 75 on AOL Instant Messenger, with an away message that accused your favorite cryptid of needing to use my house phone. The limitations of dial-up internet would make for its own horror story, don't you think? For years, I went by Bones on the online cryptid communities. I wasn't anyone's favorite person, though. I was a skeptic. I was never saying, I found the bones, or I know the bones are out there. I was the guy asking the question, if these species really do exist, where are their bones? It didn't earn me the greatest reputation. It cost me a few friends, I'm sure. I got addicted to shutting down the theories of others. I'd log in to comb the boards for questions from curious newcomers or for encounter stories from the most reputable of our members. I'd spend an hour, sometimes hours, cramming my skepticism into my keyboard and across the web. That behavior got me banned from a few locations. I didn't care. Getting kicked out of those communities felt like a trophy at the time. You can see why, all these years later, admitting to all of that might be a little embarrassing, especially since I've seen the bones myself. I had the opportunity to hike to Crater Lake in the spring of 2018. I'm not from the Pacific Northwest, so the chance to see a new part of the country at my age wasn't something I could just pass up. It might be the single most beautiful part of the United States. The clarity of the water, history of the collapsed volcano that formed the lake beds, it's magical. The last thing on my mind when we set up camp 3 miles northeast of Cleetwood Cave was the years that I had wasted harassing conspiracy theorists on the internet. I was still entranced by the beauty of the world around us. Then, after sunset, I was hypnotized all over again by the sea of stars that waited for us. My friend and I spent a long while by the campfire before retiring to our tents. The ground was pretty stiff, but it was still easy for me to sleep. We'd learn later that we both woke around the same time. There was this low growl outside of my tent. I could barely hear it, but I could feel it in my chest. I woke and the hairs on my arms were already standing on end. Something heavy shifted its feet in the dirt outside my tent. I heard slow breathing and a heavy snort. I read about what to do in a bear attack. I couldn't remember a single word at that moment. If it was a bear, I thought, I was done for. Even when I was stricken by that fear, I felt this trip was worth it. At least I got to see Crater Lake, I remember thinking. Then came the sound of a few quick strides. The low growl, the breathing, it was all suddenly gone. I didn't hear the animal's feet hit the ground more than 3 times, and it had still cleared our camp completely. There was no sign of it among the trees when I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My friend was out there too. It was his ghost-white expression that drew my attention to the dirt. I followed his eyes and I found it. All around our campsite was patterns of tracks, shaped like a foot of a man or an ape. One print was so close to the entrance of my tent that I could already compare it to the size of my own feet. I could stand heel to toe and still not cover that whole track. All of my years as a skeptic came rushing back to me. I imagine, as I looked down at the impossible footprint, that I was overcome by the same compulsion that motivated all those believers on those message boards. I needed to know. My friend had already started packing up. I ran in the direction of those tracks instead. I tried to stay low and quiet, but if I'm being honest, I'm no hunter. I'm sure the beast knew I was coming. If that's the case, then it let me close in. I spotted it between the trees. The hulking hairy shape was illuminated well by the sky full of stars. I ducked behind this tree, and hoped that the trunk would protect me from any sort of retaliation. To my surprise, the massive ape-like thing didn't turn to face me. It was staring at the ground, working a crooked tree branch across the ground like a rake. Seeing the animal use a tool was terrifying enough. That meant it couldn't be far from human. I crept in a circle around the animal, scaling a short hill to get a better view of the dirt it was tilling. That was when I realized what the monster was doing. There was another one. Whatever this massive ape-like creature was, it wasn't an anomaly. There was another one of those beasts, laying in a grave at the feet of the monster I'd followed. Tools and burial rituals. My heart dropped into my stomach. I ran again, this time back toward the campsite. There was a roar behind me. Was it a roar or a howl? I couldn't have imagined it. It started low, then rose into this shrill 3 barking yelps, and then it trailed off. The sound spread a heat in my gut like lightning. I was sure the animal was going to follow me back and punish me for what I had seen. It wasn't until we were in the car that I told my friend what was out there. He didn't believe me. I went online and tried to share my story. As you can imagine, I wasn't the most reliable source of new information. I'm writing you now to explain, to a present theory that maybe you haven't considered. All these sightings of cryptids, I know you've asked the same questions that I have. Maybe we haven't found that single piece of irrefutable proof because they're smart enough to hide it from us. Small towns come with their own dirty little secrets, and my hometown is no different. Located about 30 minutes south of Oklahoma City, a tiny blink and you'll miss it type of town exists. Slaughterville is literally a convenience store, a few housing additions, and like 4 intersections big. But it's home to crazy, insane stories like the one I'm about to tell you. No one ever really wants to talk about this to outside people. We get tired of getting laughed and made fun of. I'm going to tell you anyway. Believe me if you want, but at least hear me out. It was back in 2015. I had just moved back, and I was staying with my aunt and her family while I was looking for my own place. I wasn't thrilled with staying in Slaughterville, but beggars can't be choosers, or whatever the saying is. I enjoyed being outside during the day. It was always fun to watch the kids on dirt bikes and 4-wheelers race up and down the red dirt road. But after dark, that is a whole other monster, and one I didn't enjoy. We spent most of our time hanging out on the porch, laughing at the shenanigans and watching the kids play. But once the sun started to set, we all headed back inside and hid out. We avoided the outside as much as we could after dark. On this night in particular, my girlfriend drove down to see me. I asked her to be there before dark, but her work held her up. I wasn't overly comfortable with hanging out in the car after dark, but I went ahead and gave in. We had been outside for about 45 minutes when I could feel the energy around us change. The air got thick and felt electric. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. I was getting really anxious. Of course, she just kept talking. She had no idea the kind of weird things that happened out here, especially after dark. I kept looking around the car as she chatted. I was trying to follow along, but honestly, I was distracted. I was really anxious. Something was off. I watched in horror as a young woman appeared in front of our car. She was gorgeous and wore this old hospital gown. She looked completely normal, except for the fact that she was glowing faintly. I gasped and pointed ahead of us out of the window. My girlfriend covered her mouth and watched as this girl floated closer to the car, until she was right in front of the bumper. We just watched silently as she raised her arm and reached behind her head. She pulls out this giant knife from her back, and it was stained red. I looked at my girlfriend in the seat next to me and grabbed her. I knew that nothing was going to happen to us, but I was still terrified. She kept her eyes glued to the spot in front of us. I turned back around and watched as this girl looked at us and started crying. She was begging for our help. My girlfriend started to open the door to get out, but I grabbed it and yanked it shut. We could not get out and interact with whatever this thing was. As the girl realized that we weren't going to help, she got angry, and the tears stopped. She pointed the knife at us and started screaming. but the screams were wrong. They came in waves, and I had to let go of the door and cover my ears. We stayed in the car, listening to this girl scream at us until she simply vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone. My girlfriend looked at me, eyes wide and panicked. I just reached out and pulled her into a hug. I was freaked out, even though I knew what happened out there. I couldn't imagine how she was feeling. We decided that maybe it was time for her to wrap up her visit, and for her to head back to the city. We said our goodbyes, and I made sure that I let her know not to stop for any hitchhikers on the way out of town. Don't even stop if you see someone walking on the road. Just drive by them. Picking up hitchhikers isn't safe in general, but definitely not out here. She agreed and she headed home, but it was only 5 minutes before I got a frantic call. She was clearly panicking as she told me that at the stop sign there was an older woman in a gown walking toward her car. I told her to lock their doors and not to look at her, just drive. I stayed on the phone with her, trying to calm her down. Once she had turned out of the neighborhood and back onto the road to the highway, she noticed a black shadow following her. I let her know, just keep driving, but my blood ran cold. I could hear the fear in her voice as she told me whatever it was behind them was keeping up, even as they sped back to the highway. I promised to stay on the phone even as she went in and out of service, making sure that I kept my voice calm. I know the creatures that live out here, but this figure didn't make sense to me. As she described it to me, I tried to keep as calm as I could. It was a black shadow with no eyes. It appeared in the shape of a tall man, 7 or 8 feet tall, and was fast. She was easily doing 80, and this thing was constantly in her rearview mirror. It followed her until she hit Norman city limits, when it growled low and deep and suddenly disappeared. And only then did we feel safe enough to hang up. We still don't know exactly what followed her, but she isn't the only one to experience being followed. I have so many more stories I could tell, but we will just leave it with this one for now. Hey there, Donovan. I'm from upstate Wisconsin, and I've got a story that I think you'll want to hear, and maybe help me out. I don't know. I don't really know how to fix this. I'm a doctor, and I work in a town of maybe 700 people. Our closest neighbor is an active army base. Sometimes I'll get visitors from there if their hospital is too busy, or they'll send a nurse or two over to help me out. The point is, I've got a good working relationship with that base. I have a patient who I'll refer to as Sharon, and she's a military wife. She came to see me once because of a health emergency. At the time, the base was too far out of reach. She's been my patient since then. I had her for a little over 5 years now. The thing about Sharon is that she's a pretty level-headed person. She doesn't make a big deal out of things. So when she came to me and said that she was concerned for her husband, Cole, I took her at her word. She said that Cole had gotten the flu and wasn't recovering like he was supposed to. He had been bedridden for 3 weeks. She took him to the VA hospital and he got released the next day, even though he wasn't any better. This immediately seemed strange to me. I trusted that VA hospital, and honestly, it was one of the better ones I'd seen. It wasn't like them to shirk their duty like that. And worst of all, my hands were tied. I wasn't Cole's primary care, so I couldn't write him a prescription. I couldn't do anything except give Sharon some tips and ask her to keep me updated. I felt terrible. She came back 2 days later and said Cole had recovered to full strength. I was as confused as she was. For him to make a turnaround like that, after being sick for so long, was bizarre. I told her to keep an eye on him just in case. Then Sharon called me around midnight on my emergency number. She said that Cole was awake but unresponsive. We did a video call on my cell phone, and I saw what she meant. He was sitting up in bed with his eyes open, but he didn't react when she talked to him, touched him, nothing. He was ignoring her. He was a serious man, and he didn't play jokes like that. It was like he didn't see her at all. I thought he had a mental break of some sort, or something in his brain had gone wrong from the flu. Sharon had tried calling the VA and been blown off each time. I told her to drive Cole to my office, and I would do all I could. They didn't even make it off the base. Sharon was turned back when she tried to leave. We were actually on the phone at the time because she had put me on a video call and left me on mute. I couldn't see much because of the way she hid the phone in her purse, but I heard what was going on. A pair of officers argued with her and wore her down, even though they could all see the shape Cole was in. There was nothing I could do. The next day, one of the VA doctors came to my office. He was accompanied by a soldier, but that guy at least had the courtesy to stay in the waiting room. The doctor asked me about my relationship to Sharon. He wanted me to turn over all my files on both her and Cole. I didn't have anything the VA hospital wouldn't already know about, and I had nothing on Cole at all. I told him so. He didn't seem convinced. There was nothing I could give him without violating a patient privacy law. That alone made his visit pointless. We both knew that, but I think he tried to bulldoze over me just to prove that he could. After that, I was scared to contact Sharon. I didn't want to get her into any more trouble with the Army. Still, I didn't want to leave her on her own. Another 2 days passed before she was able to call me again. She said Cole had returned to normal and acting like nothing was wrong. He didn't seem to be in any pain, but as soon as the sun went down, he'd go quiet again. I told her she needed to time how long he was functional. We had to figure out if he was awake for a set number of hours, or if it was really linked to the nighttime. By this point, I was pretty sure this was some sort of medical experiment. Sharon was probably thinking the same thing, but neither of us risked saying it over the phone. I couldn't think of any way to help her. Another couple days passed. When Sharon called me again, it was to say that Cole had been admitted into the VA hospital. She didn't know whether this would be the end of it or if he'd come out even worse. I didn't hear from her for weeks after that. No one else from the Army came to my office. I got a letter from Sharon after a while. It wasn't much. She just let me know that Cole was okay and had been reassigned to a base in Illinois. All of this happened over the past fall. I haven't seen either of them since September, and I don't know how they're doing. Sharon asked me to get in touch with some of her and Cole's family, and I have, but they don't know much more than I do. Thanks for listening. Maybe Sharon is out there listening too. I don't know. If they're out there, and I hope they are, I hope they're okay. I was driving through Niagara Falls, Canada. It's an easier route than going through the States. Less traffic. Speed limit seems to be not as high too, Easy driving. I have a Ford Flex, a big SUV van hybrid deal. So I packed it up, threw the kids in it and the wife, and headed out. We left early, around 3 a.m. I live outside of Detroit, so it took some time to go through the city and over the bridge. The city was pretty much empty at that time, even the freeway. It was nice to see the city without people for once. Kind of eerie too, but quiet and peaceful. I rolled down the window a bit and just took in the early morning air. It was nice not to have to fight traffic, and there wasn't much construction being done. So none of the route was closed off or barreled off with construction barrels. The wife and the kids fell back asleep pretty fast. The kids as soon as we backed out of the driveway, pretty much. My wife after we went through security and over the bridge. Luckily, we weren't one of the random cars they stopped and searched. I stopped at McDonald's in Windsor, right next to the bridge to get some coffee for the road, and then I jumped right onto the provincial freeway heading out. It was great. There was hardly any traffic in the city, and barely a soul on the highway. I could have counted the amount of cars I saw in one hand. It's just a nice easy drive, and I'm not a fan of driving really. I've never really liked it. Don't get me wrong, I'll do it, especially on long trips like this. I just don't like traffic. I don't like the congestion, the stopping, the going, all of that. I like to take in the scenery, not to be bothered with stress and waits and people laying on their horns. I think most people are probably in agreement when it comes to that stuff. It's hard for some people to stay awake on the roads like this, though. They tell you to watch out for other cars, and especially sleepy truckers. Keep vigilant and all that. I had the family, the coffee, so I was okay. There's also not very many lights on some of the more open stretches of the highway. Near towns and cities you're okay, but on open stretches, it's dark and hard to see at times. The first rest stop we hit after an hour on the highway, the kids stayed asleep. Me and the wife took turns hitting the bathrooms. Me especially after all the coffee. There's like no one really around. And yeah, those stops can be kind of creepy. And sometimes, stuff happens at those rest stops. Anyway, I walked around the parking lot and around the car, stretching my legs after being in the seat for so long. The air was nice and cool for once. It had been pretty hot that week. There were a couple of semis parked in the dark section of the lot. 2 other cars seemed to be travelers like us, a family and an older couple. The rest stops are usually pretty brightly lit to attract the eye from the road, I think. After I walked around a bit more, I finally got back into the car and we headed out onto the road. It was another maybe half hour or 38 minutes tops, barren highway, nothing but open countryside on either side. I go to yawn and something dark moves across the road, and I hit it. It's not deer season, it's June. What the hell did I just hit? That was my first thought. I don't know why, maybe because of the size of it, but again, it wasn't deer season, so what are the odds? Anyway, I slow down the car and get off to the side. My wife wakes up. I tell her that I think I hit something. Maybe a deer, maybe a dog, I don't know. I look in the rearview mirror and I don't see anything. It's still pretty dark out. There's not really any lights. Anyway, I decide to get out of the car and use my phone as a flashlight. I stop though because it's dark and it's early morning. I guess I kind of just froze waiting for something to happen. It's kind of a silly reaction, but it happens. And you feel kind of ridiculous. I guess I was waiting to hear something, maybe. Or wait for something to get up and move. I'm not really sure. But I just stood next to the car for a few minutes before I started to move super slowly back to see what I hit. I didn't see anything at first, but about maybe 10 feet from the car, I see a weird pale sack in some of the grass at the side of the road. I look around, shine a light, and don't really see anything else. I walk up closer, and the sack gets bigger, and then the folds kind of move, and I stop. This thing shoots out. I mean, it really moves, and I drop my phone. I go to pick it up and follow where it's moving, and I see arms and legs shuffling, and this thing is taking off for a group of trees. I'm just standing there in shock, trying to make out what in the hell is this thing. What I thought was a pale-like sackcloth is skin, I think, and this thing is traveling on all fours. I didn't get a good look at its face, but I saw these big black circles. Maybe its eyes. It was moving so fast it was hard to tell. I thought about going after it. I even moved up closer and down towards the trees. It didn't make any noise, but I could hear it moving through the brush. But I stopped myself thinking about my kids and my wife in the car. I just stood still, flashing my light near the trees, trying to see something. I could hear it moving after a while, too. It just got quiet and still. I heard my wife call out to me, but it took a few seconds to register. I just got back into the car and sat down. I didn't know what to think or what to do. I just told my wife it was nothing and started the car back up. It took maybe 2 days before I could tell my wife. She said she believed me. I don't know. I don't believe me. It was the strangest experience in my life. I still don't believe it at times. I spent this last summer working as a camp counselor near Rocky Mountain Park in Colorado. Well, I wasn't really a counselor, more of a camp aide. I helped the actual counselors maintain the camp and keep an eye on the kids. I don't want to give any names because I don't think the camp deserves any negative publicity for what happened. I had been attending this camp for the better part of a decade and knew some of the other kids and folks who worked there very well. I spent most of my time with these guys as I did my own parents. Every summer, like clockwork, I was shipped off to camp for all of July and half of August. I didn't really mind though. The counselors took really good care of the kids, and every day was kind of like a new adventure. Canoeing, hiking, and horseback riding was the norm, not to mention the nightly feast and campfire songs. It could be kind of cheesy at times, but everyone was always having a good time, so who cares? This summer, I was finally old enough not to have to go to camp, but I knew they were always looking for aides, and I didn't really have any other plans, so I took a job with the camp, knowing I was pretty much getting paid to do all the cool stuff I like to do anyway. It was about the end of the 3rd week when this bizarre event occurred. The group I was with, made up of 14 kids, 2 counselors and another aide, had went out for the day for an extended hike. Now these kind of activities were for older kids at the camp, around 13 or 14. so you could imagine the noise level of this rambunctious caravan. We had left at 8 a.m., hiked 5 miles, and stopped for lunch, preparing to turn around and head back afterwards. The kids were pretty ambitious that day, so the 5 miles was a good bit deeper than we would normally go. It wasn't really a big deal though. The counselors knew the area like their own living rooms, and the spot we stopped at had a cool spring which the kids took turns swimming in. I was sitting not too far away from the kids in the spring, eating lunch and just chatting with the other aide, when we heard this sharp crack echo throughout the surrounding forest. All the activity in our little group stopped for a minute, and we heard it again followed by another crack, this time from a different direction. After the third crack, the oldest counselor in the group, we'll call him Benny, started scrambling to get the kids out of the spring and dressed. Me and the other aide were confused and a little unnerved to see him acting this way. Benny was an older guy, real outdoorsy and totally comfortable in the forest. Me and the other aide jumped up, leaving our lunch sitting on a log, and rushed over to Benny to figure out what was going on. Then we heard it. It was a deep bellow, not unlike a bear's roar, but I could have sworn that it was almost human. Whatever it was answered by another bellow from where the other cracking noise had come from. Benny was screaming to run at this point and shouted for me to take point. I grabbed a few nearby kids and yelled for the rest to follow me, moving fast back the way we had come. As we ran, I looked back a few times to see if we had everyone, but couldn't stop long enough to tell. I just hoped that Benny and the other counselor had gotten a head count. We ran non-stop for a good 10 minutes, until I heard Benny from the back of the group calling for a halt. I was wheezing heavily by now. A full run through the mountain trail isn't like a jog on a paved street. There's roots, rocks, and a dozen other things that slow you down. And frankly, we were lucky nobody had fallen badly enough to get hurt or broken an ankle. Me and the other aide got it together enough to do a quick head count, while Benny and the other counselor went off to the side to talk. After confirming all the kids were with us, I went over to join Benny and the other counselor. I managed to catch the tail end of their conversation. I heard the other counselor saying to Benny that they should be 100 miles away from here, and Benny responded they must have moved further east, and that they've claimed this territory as their own. The rest of the conversation was cut short by a roar from nearby, followed by a thud and a scream coming from the main body of the group. Something had tossed a small boulder into the mass of kids, nearly taking the head off one of the boys leaning against a tree. There was a hysteria throughout the group, and the kids almost started running off in separate directions, when Barry shouted commands and pulled everyone back together. The other camp counselor got the kids moving in a unified pack. As we all started running down the trail, I saw Benny cutting off from the group. All alone, he was yelling and slapping 2 sticks together like he was trying to make as much noise as possible. The rest of that trek back to the camp was one long blurry collection of running and stumbling and some infrequent stops. A few times the kids asked me what happened and where Benny went, but I didn't have answers for them. Near the point of exhaustion, we finally made it back to camp. The kids were all ushered to their cabins, and all the aides were assigned a cabin to sleep in and watch over for the night. We were given strict orders to not, for any reason at all, leave the cabin or let the kids leave the cabin, unless a camp counselor physically entered the cabin and told us we could. We were even given a few buckets in case we needed to answer nature's call. When we woke up the next day, we were finally allowed out of our cabins. We were called for a general assembly. Benny had made it back to camp sometime in the middle of the night. He had cuts all up and down his left side of his body, and his arm was in a sling. He stood next to the camp director as he informed us that due to unnaturally aggressive bear activity, any activities outside of the camp would be suspended until further notice. The excitement died down over the next few days. Even without leaving the camp itself, there was still plenty to do. And since these kids' parents had paid for the full summer, we finished out the next few weeks. I got a nice paycheck, and then we went back home. About a month later, I received an email from the camp director telling me that next year's camping season was canceled. It would reopen the following year in a new location about 80 miles south. I live in a suburb of Los Angeles, right by a recognizable body of water. I'll leave it at that. The lake was a nice place to swim. It was a nice alternative to the salty ocean water and noisy beaches. I was a swimmer in high school and college, before I joined the adult world and became a working stiff. It was a nice way to de-stress after a difficult day at the office. My town has a local legend. It was always just a silly joke that no one took seriously. Since I was a kid, I was told by teachers and adults that the lake was home to a terrifying sea serpent. It used to terrify us as kids, but it became a draw to the lake. Tourists flocked to our small town, and it became an expensive resort town, hoping to see the serpent. The locals seemed to adopt this legend as enthusiastically as the tourists. My swim team even had the same sea serpent logo as the touristy t-shirts. It was a point of pride for us. We were the sea monsters. We're ferocious and we swim faster than you. That is always what it was to me. A silly story and a campy mascot. Any actual query into the existence of this creature was always seen as kinda dumb. It was like a conspiracy theory. Fun to talk about, but not that deep. Anyone who read that deep into this type of story was seen as a troll or making fun. Nothing too serious about it. The day of the incident was the hottest day on record. It was peak summer, and the humidity coming off the lake made it very uncomfortable to walk around. When I arrived at work, the unthinkable happened. The air conditioner was broken. It had to be about 95 degrees at my desk, so a few coworkers and I found our way to a favorite nearby coffee shop and rubbed elbows around a tiny table. After what felt like an eternity, we made it to 5 p.m. My coworkers wanted to get drinks, but I decided to head home. I had enough of being in such proximity to all of them, and I really wanted some space. I was also dying for a swim. I said goodbye and went home. I changed into my bathing suit and got my bike out of the basement. I set out around the lake and made pretty good time. Slowly, the suburban sidewalks turned into a dirt path until I got to my usual swimming spot. It took some bushwhacking off-road, but the view of the city was beautiful, and it was a spot that was entirely unknown. I took my shirt off and left it by my bike and prepared for the swim. The water felt amazing on my legs, and I found myself immediately diving straight into the cool water. Relief flooded through me instantly. That thing I was craving all day felt so good. I finally cleared my head and started to relax. I was bobbing up and down a bit in the water at first, and then I started treading water. I should have known something was off when I heard the frogs. Usually this was a quiet spot, but this evening it was like a symphony. It unnerved me slightly that they were so loud. It made something feel different about today. I don't know why, but the lake felt impossibly large, and I had never been smaller. Still, the water felt nice and I was dying to get my blood flowing. I started to work on my crawl stroke until I was almost at the center of the lake. I treaded water and began to float on my back. I closed my eyes for what must have been a second. I swear on my life, something swam past me. I know well the sensation of a swimmer going past you, and this felt the same, but it was fast and big. I righted myself in the water and looked around. Nothing, all was quiet. I took this as my sign to head back to shore, so I began swimming again. While crawling, I took breaths under my right arm, just as I was taught. As I neared the shore, I saw something. It looked like a huge eye, the eye of a fish. In my panic, I flipped around and righted myself once again. Nothing on the surface. I looked down. Something gigantic, much larger than me, swam 20 feet under my legs. I looked hard in the water, trying to make out its features. Whatever it was, it stopped some distance away from me. It had this long body like a snake, and the head of a dragon I had seen on a television show. The water around me was still warm from how fast it passed me. Then in a moment, it dipped into the darkness of the lake. A few days have passed since then. I don't remember getting home, but I must have gone fast. I've been going about my days like normal, but no swimming. I began to do some reading to see if anyone had experienced what I had seen, or anything like that. That's how I found your show. I'd be so happy if you read this online. Maybe give me a little clarity to what I saw. I don't know when I'll swim again, but I'll be careful when I do. I've been a park ranger for 15 years. I worked most of that time in the Ponderosa forests of Arizona, but a few years ago, I headed back up north. My family is from Twin Falls, Idaho. My parents are getting older, so I wanted to be closer to check on them more often. I got a post about Craters of the Moon National Monument. I had a research position, so I was moving into a pretty remote station. It was quite a distance from the nearest town. After I moved in, it seemed like things kept going wrong. The solar power was glitchy and wasn't working half of the time. My sleep was suffering from weird disturbances. There were a lot of species of bats there, which was fine, but they kept getting into my cabin somehow. I kept getting awakened by the flapping and squeaking, and I couldn't find how they were getting in. I lived in the middle of juniper and scraggly pine and sagebrush, and for some reason, that landscape gave me an eerie feeling. It felt so different from the southwest ponderosa forest that I was used to. About 2 months into the job, I started hearing something walking and scratching on the deck at night. Sometimes it even sounded like it was scratching on the door. The area was known for its wood rats, so I chalked it up to that. Whenever I went to check it out, nothing was there. I assumed they scurried away when I opened up the door. Then I started finding these dismembered bats. Sometimes they were torn in half, but mostly I'd just find their wings on my deck. I've always been a relaxed person, so the fact that I was feeling so edgy was out of character for me. Whenever I'd leave the cabin at night, I had this eerie feeling like I was being watched. One night, I was getting back from my shopping run that I did once a week. While I was parking, I suddenly got this bad feeling. At the time, I didn't have my shotgun in the vehicle. I got out of the truck and was hit by this heavy smell. It was like a mix of wet dog and this super concentrated urine smell. I went around to the passenger side to get my groceries. I looked to the left of the cabin and saw these two glowing eyes about 50 feet from my front door. They looked to be about 5 or 6 feet in the air. I was freaked out, to say the least. I started yelling, "Get the hell out of here!" But the eyes just crouched lower down. I assumed it might be a bobcat or a mountain lion, but I wouldn't normally associate that scent with a big cat, so it seemed odd. I threw a piece of wood toward it, and it leapt back a bit, but it didn't make any sound. I threw 3 or 4 more pieces at it, and it retreated a little further back. At this point, I abandoned the groceries and started fumbling with my keys. I made a mad dash to the front door and managed to get inside and get my shotgun. When I came out, the eyes looked a little bit closer. I couldn't get a good look at it though. It was out of range of the porch light. I didn't want to shoot it if I didn't have to. I held the shotgun and I kept throwing pieces of wood with one hand. Finally, it walked away into the brush. I waited for a good 10 or 15 minutes before I rushed to get my groceries and get back inside. I eventually calmed down enough to make dinner. I kept the shotgun right beside me. I couldn't imagine what was attracting it to my deck. I kept the place clean and was obsessive about not having a trace of food around. A couple of hours later, I was sitting at the table reading, and I heard that scratching sound again. This time, I could swear I also heard this low growling sound. By then, I was feeling like a nervous wreck. It felt like this thing was stalking me. I went to the window and raised the blinds about an inch and looked out. I assumed it saw the movement because when I looked out, it had its back to me and was heading off the deck. I just froze when I saw this bipedal monster over 6 feet tall. It wasn't a cat at all. It looked like an upright canine creature with his humped back and massive shoulders. The legs almost looked human, but were huge, and the knees were all weird like a dog's. I was just shocked at the size. When it got about 20 feet away, it turned around and I saw the face of this demonic-looking wolf. I was shaking so bad, but I managed to open the window a crack and was ready to shoot it right through the screen. It shot off into the darkness like a rocket. I've never seen something that big move that fast. My mind had no reference point for an animal like that. I slept on the couch with my shotgun that night. I'm sure I woke up at least every hour thinking I heard something. In the morning, a trail crew came up and we found huge tracks on the porch and leading away from the cabin. Huge canine tracks with long claws. After that night, I always thought I heard scratching on the deck, but never found tracks. I was afraid I was losing it. As soon as possible, I got transferred to the main guard station, where I could be around coworkers a lot of the time. But eventually, I convinced my parents to move to Arizona, and I went back to the park I was familiar with. I just couldn't take that kind of stress. Hi, Donovan. I'm married, so sometimes my wife and I will go visit her home state. She's mourning the loss of her parents, and it just relieves her to see a familiar face. We go fairly often, at least twice a year. She loves to get a few things from there, stuff you wouldn't be able to get where we live. And sometimes we like to go to the family home and fish in the river out back. We had done our rounds a few weeks ago, and we were on our way home when we saw something that was hard to make sense of. My wife grew up in a very superstitious culture. I, on the other hand, not so much. I'm very much a person of facts and reason. I guess that's what makes my story all the more unusual. We were driving through a part of the state before crossing back into our town. That weekend was so windy that we didn't fish once. I actually brought all the night crawlers back for our grandkids' turtles. Anyways, the wind was wild, and it was snowing. We always try to beat the snow this time of year, but I guess that didn't work out either. This part of the state is very flat, so between the fallen snow and sky, the place was almost entirely white. Now, I say almost because there was something else out there. There was something walking upright off in the distance. I thought my eyes were fooling me, but my wife must have seen it too, because she stopped talking. It was tall and thin and dark, and as we got closer to this entity, I'm not sure what else to call it, I could clearly see that it was wearing a pointed black hat and some type of blue shawl over its shoulders. They were struggling to walk against the wind. I mean, it was blowing pretty hard. And they continued walking through the harshness of it all. I was pretty impressed. But that's when nothing started to make much sense. Who was this person? Why were they walking in the middle of nowhere? And why were they doing it in this type of weather? Now, let me make this very clear. This part of the state is desolate. It's flat. It's rural. There's not a sign of civilization for miles. Yet this person, whoever they are, was walking through it as if they were on a mission. I don't know what it could have possibly been, but I wanted to make sure I could identify them as a person, as if anything else was an option. To me, it wasn't, right? My wife started to get uncomfortable. I could tell. All she kept saying was, "What is that?" I didn't know how to respond. How could I? I couldn't even understand what I was seeing. The questions kept coming. What is that? But I just kept thinking, who is that? My wife instructed me to keep going so we could get as close of a look as we could. I didn't want to tell her that I had already planned to do so because I was just as curious as she was. If I had, it might have made her more scared, because I'm not usually the type to get curious. As we moved forward through the snow and the wind, which by the way got louder as we approached the traveler, we were able to get a better look. It had this tall pointed hat and a blue shawl, but we couldn't see the face. Something told me I needed to see that face. I had to. There was no other option. I'm not sure why this was so important to me, seeing the face of something that looked like an insane person traveling through the snow. I had to. And not long after I thought about this, my wife uttered, "We have to see their face." We continued to drive, and soon we were looking close enough to see the face of whoever or whatever this thing was. I looked across my wife and out through her window on the passenger side. My wife was looking as well. Chills ran through me. I didn't think I could get much colder, but I did, and the hair stood up on my arms and my neck and my back. As we passed this stranger, we looked out, and as we looked out, the individual looked in. They were looking right at us. The best way I can describe the face of this person, or whatever you want to call it, is that it was all black. I'm not sure if it was painted black or if the person was wearing some type of mask, but their face was completely black. All I could see were the eyes. Those eyes peering back at us. No other features could be seen. Not a nose, not a mouth. This faceless person, whoever they were, was just as interested in us as we were of it, and that is probably the most frightening part of all of it. I thought to myself, all right, this person has an unusual mask, but that doesn't make the situation unusual. But my wife, she was still frozen stiff. She was hardly moving. So we pass this individual and keep driving, and just as I start to see them in my rearview mirror, I notice their path changes. They're no longer walking the same way as they were before. Instead, they began walking behind the car, like they were crossing the road. So I start to wonder, what are they doing? The only reasonable thing that crossed my mind at the time is that maybe they were looking for roadkill. Now, why were they looking for roadkill was a whole different can of worms I did not want to open, but it made the most sense, and I was relatively content with it. But that's when things got more bizarre. The person crossed the road. Both my wife and I are watching them. They make it across the road, and in an instant, they vanish. Again, this is flat land, as flat as you can get, and the terrain is completely white. So where did they go? Who were they? Why was their face black with no nose and no mouth? What were they doing out in the middle of the desert in the snow? I can't answer any of this. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. Last summer, I'd gone to a family reunion in Lake Tahoe for a weekend. I ended up getting on the road really late to drive home. I do live in Nevada, but east of Tahoe in a town called Fallon. It's about an hour-and-a-half drive from Tahoe. I had to drive home that night because I had to be back for work the next day. The drive was along Highway 50, which is known as the loneliest road in America. It goes through a lot of the desolate desert area and is boring to say the least. I had been driving about 45 minutes, and I was starting to get really tired. I felt this sleepiness coming on, and I could tell it was going to get really hard to fight. I don't know if you've heard of microsleep, but sometimes you can fall asleep for like 30 seconds at a time, and you don't even know you've been asleep. It's obviously really dangerous if it happens while you're driving. It used to happen to me more often than I care to admit, because I was working 2 jobs and was always sleep deprived. I tried playing loud music and sticking my head out the window. I tried just yelling at myself over and over again, but my brain wasn't having it, and I just felt so drowsy. I knew I needed to take a break, but I didn't feel safe just pulling over right on the side of the road. I finally came to this old dirt road that headed off to the right, so I turned and drove to this little stand of bushes and tried to conceal my car a bit. I don't even know why I was so paranoid, but I felt like I'd attract unwanted attention from the few other cars that had been passing. I looked at the clock and saw that it was 11:33, and then I fell asleep. A while later, this scratching sound partially woke me up. It was like this metallic sound, like something was scratching the car. I looked at the clock and it was 12:07. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and I was still half asleep, so I didn't even really look around. I just went back to sleep. I was later awakened by the same sound, and it was 12:57. This time it started worrying me because the sound didn't stop. The thought ran across my mind that it was just an animal inspecting the car. But why would it come back almost an hour after it had left the previous time? I was trying to wake up all the way, but I just couldn't. Then, inside of my head, I felt like it started vibrating really loud. It was almost painful, but not quite. And then it turned into this high-pitched ring that was about the loudest sound I'd heard in my life. I opened my window and was hit with this strong smell of sulfur. For some reason, I thought that meant I was near a hot spring or something. The scratching had stopped by then. I turned on my headlights, and in front of my car I saw a small group of strange humanoid creatures. They were about 4 feet tall. They were standing in a triangular shape, and the one in front was slightly taller than the others. The ringing in my head was making me feel like I couldn't think straight. The taller one stepped forward and stared into my eyes. It had these black eyes. Everything about them was black. The pupils, the retinas, the part that should be white was black. The skin on the face seemed almost bumpy. But while I was watching it, it seemed to be almost plastic, like glossy looking. The creatures were sort of holographic and bluish gray in color, and they were able to fade in and out of visibility. It looked like a steam or mist was rising from them. I immediately got goosebumps all over my back. It was steadily gazing at me, and the stare seemed to go on for days. I felt all the knowledge I had in me was being sucked out, like my whole consciousness was being read. Then, all of a sudden, I was blinded by a flash of light, like someone had taken a picture of me with this really bright flash. And then I felt completely drained. I had no energy. My soul felt hollow, and the beings were no longer in front of me. I looked in my rearview mirror and just managed to catch a glimpse of something running way behind me. It actually seemed more like figures made of light were drifting away behind my car. I fully expected to see some kind of spaceship or something, but there was nothing like that around as far as I could see. At least I finally felt completely awake and thought to myself, I have to get the hell out of here. I started the car and got back on the road, and as I headed east again, I saw that the sun was starting to rise. I looked at my clock and saw it was almost 6 a.m. I had lost about 5 hours since I last checked my clock. For months, I questioned my sanity and reality. I knew I couldn't tell anyone, but when I found your channel, I felt like I had to say something, and it's just a real relief to be able to speak about this to someone. I've heard about some strange things happening out in the desert, and I think I've seen some strange lights in the sky out there, but what happened to me that night was really up close and personal. I will never feel the same again. Hi, Donovan. First, let me say, I love your show. I've had an encounter that really has me puzzled, to say the least. This happened when I was hiking near Olympic National Park. It was a Sunday morning, and the day looked like it was going to be beautiful. I'm about 20 minutes into my hike, and then something catches my attention out of the corner of my eye. It was an unusual creature with these short legs that I had never seen before. It was standing about 40 feet into the woods. At first, I thought it was a bear or some other animal, but as I got closer, I noticed that this creature had a bright reddish-brown fur. It had long arms and this humanoid face. It wasn't until later that I realized it might be some type of Sasquatch, but I don't understand why it was so low to the ground. I'm not really sure. I was scared, but also intrigued. I wanted to find out more about it. As I approached, it turned and quickly ran into the woods. I followed it for a few minutes, hoping to catch up with it, but I eventually lost sight as it disappeared into the trees. I don't know why I followed it. I just had this feeling like it wasn't dangerous. I don't know exactly what this creature was, but it looked kind of like a Sasquatch. All I can say is, whatever it was, its presence left me feeling a bit unnerved and curious at the same time. This is the craziest thing that I've ever seen. I live near Lake Superior in Wisconsin. I was out fishing as usual when I stumbled upon a very large animal that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It was walking on the land and had these large teeth protruding from its mouth. It seemed to be hunting for something in the water. I quickly reeled in my line and made sure not to get too close. As I watched this creature from afar, I began to realize that it must have been some type of ancient creature from millions of years ago. Suddenly, this creature disappeared into the lake, never to be seen again. This thing was probably about 8 feet long. It had this bluish-gray, scaly skin, almost like a cross between a lizard and a fish, and an almost human-like face, and these massive teeth. I've seen fish before on Animal Planet that have a human-like face, and that's kind of what it looked like. Anyways, I've been back to my same fishing spot several times since, but I never saw that creature again. No one wants to be the person with the stick. Working in animal control, just showing up with a pole, makes you the enemy of the very animals you're there to help. When a wild animal becomes a danger to itself or to a community, someone has to do the job. There's the responder who tracks the animal, the one who tries to calm it down, and then there's me. I'm the one with the stick, and I hate using it. You know the one, don't you? The pole with a noose-like collar hanging from one end. Did you know that they come in different sizes? There are small ones for kittens and puppies, and larger ones for raccoons and opossums. Larger ones yet for dogs and deer. If the animal's got a neck, we've got a noose that will fit. Pretty morbid, huh? You can see why I didn't like my job at the time. As far as the animals were concerned, I was the hangman. I never hurt them, of course. I never lost any wildlife on the job. That was never enough to change how I felt. On the day that this story takes place, we were responding to a call about feral cats. Feral was the word the caller used to describe them. That wasn't our word. All we knew was that an abandoned house in a poor neighborhood had been overrun by strays. The cats were starting to terrorize the neighborhood, looting garbage bins and cornering small pets and children. Something had to be done. We knew right away that the job wasn't going to be easy. The cats weren't going to come calmly with their paws up. They were going to need the noose. That day may have been the first time I was actually thankful to be the person holding the other end of that instrument. We took a look at the house before going in. The foundation was weak, crumbling and cracking, even on the outside of the home. The porch roof was slanted and sagging. We had walked through worse. After reviewing our safety precautions, we thought nothing of it. We weren't going to let an old building stop us from doing our jobs. Caroline went in first, speaking in the soft voice that I'd seen tame a dozen stray dogs. Max was behind her with a metal cage under his arm. That left me in the back, pole slung over my shoulder and sorry written on my face. I didn't want to take all those cats back to the shelter. I knew the majority of them would be euthanized. If we'd arrived sooner, maybe that wouldn't have been the case. As it stood, the time it took us to respond to the call was too great. A different fate had already befell the cats. There were immediate signs of a fight, tufts of fur, and small spatters of blood. Caroline spotted a claw laying on the floor, torn from its place on a cat's paw. It didn't seem like the cats had been killed. There had been a fight and they had abandoned the house. It made sense. Then something moved in the building. The sound of wood dragging across floorboards. And then a heavy thud. We asked if anyone else was inside. There was no answer. Max stayed in the first area to search for any cats that had stayed behind. Caroline and I went to investigate the sound. We found the entrance to the basement. The door was left open. Wide scratch marks lined the tile leading to the staircase. Caroline reminded me to have my pole ready. I didn't think to remind her that I was carrying the stick sized for cats. I followed her into the basement. We never had a hope of capturing the thing that made those scratches. The basement reeked of dust and urine. It was pungent enough to make me gag even before I reached the bottom stair. Caroline was made of tougher stuff than me. Her eyes were alert, looking for whatever animal we'd accidentally come to rescue. When I saw those eyes go wide, I knew we'd stumbled into something dangerous. She turned suddenly and ran by me, taking the stairs two at a time, just to put some distance between herself and the basement. I wasn't smart enough to follow. Instead, I looked. I looked and saw the creature that had scratched the floor. I saw the creature that had chased the cats from their den. It was the size of a shepherd, much too large for the small pole in my hands. It was hunched over a mound of rancid meat, rodents and squirrels and whatever else the cats had caught. Its knees bent and its shoulders slouched much like those of a man. If the lighting had been any worse, maybe I would have mistaken the creature for a squatter. Maybe I would have called the police instead of fleeing like my friend. The basement was well lit. There was no mistaking that bizarre nature of that thing huddled in the corner. Humanoid in shape, but covered in scales. Think scales like an alligator. Its teeth were long and pointed. Its eyes blinked with two sets of eyelids. And when it blinked, it saw me. It lunged. I barely had time to raise the tool in my hands. I aimed the stick for the creature's chest, stabbing it down as if I'd carried a lance and not a noose. I saw blood. It fell, surprised either by my reflexes or by my reach. And I hit those stairs even faster than Caroline had before me. I slammed the basement door shut and headed for the car where my friends were waiting. Caroline wouldn't speak of it. I told Max what I saw. He didn't believe me. His skepticism was earned when the police arrived. The next time someone entered that basement, the creature was gone. Caroline still calls me sometimes, asking if what we saw was real. I don't need that same reassurance. I don't need you to explain what this thing was, Donovan, because I know it was really there. That's all that matters to me. I still have the stick that I carried that day. The end of it is still stained with that creature's blood. Hey there, I'm a big fan of your channel, and I have a story I feel you'd definitely be interested in. It's my favorite to tell at campfires and sleepovers and things. But even though it sounds like any old dumb ghost story, it's true. It really happened. Even if no one I tell it to thinks so. When I was little, my family and I moved around quite a bit. My dad worked in construction, so we kind of adjusted based on whatever job site he was assigned to at the time. When this story took place, I was around 11. Young, but definitely cognizant, you know? I knew what was normal and what wasn't. We moved into this little apartment building, a little ways outside of Chicago. And if nothing else, the place was definitely run down. I didn't mind really because I was a kid, but it was annoying to hear my folks arguing all the time. Since I was an only child, I had to get sort of creative when it came time to play. I came up with these intricate stories with my dolls and found this little crawl space attached to my room to play in when I wanted to feel hidden. So, about that crawl space, as I said, I kept a lot of my stuff in there, so I usually left the door open. It would get stuck sometimes, and Lord knows I didn't want to accidentally trap myself in a tight space. After we lived there for a few weeks, I began to vaguely notice things in my room would be out of place. My dolls would be in totally different spots. My bed would be unmade, even if I was sure I made it. My books would be open, even if I hadn't touched them in a while. At the time, I assumed that it was due to my parents, my mom coming in to clean things up and moving all my stuff around in the process. But the thing was, my parents started commenting about it too. There was this one day, for instance, when my dad had to stay at work a little later than usual, and I was home alone for a few hours after school. This happened every once in a while and really wasn't out of the ordinary. Like normal, I hung out in my room, playing with my stuff. The next thing I knew, my dad comes home screaming at me to come downstairs. Turns out, and I kid you not, our dishwasher was open, and there were plates, cups, utensils everywhere. At least half the load was thrown all around the room, all scattered. My dad, he thought I did it. In fact, he was sure, and he was pissed. Obviously, though, I wouldn't have done that. He had to spend nearly the entire rest of the night picking up pieces of broken glass from the floor. I felt awful. Anyway, a few days later this happened. Stuff gets even weirder somehow. My mom wakes up with these massive bruises on her arms, like some serious scary movie activity. My dad is freaking out because not only is she all bruised up, but more and more random objects around the house start going missing, including his work laptop. So then, this one day, my dad kind of has a freak out. I remember sitting in my room just minding my own business, when all of a sudden, my dad swung open the door and just barged in. He didn't say anything to me, or yell really, but he was tearing my room apart. Eventually, after the fact, I hurtfully realized that it was because he seriously thought I had stolen this stuff and hid it somewhere in my room. He keeps throwing stuff around, looking, and then the crawl space kind of catches his eye. This is where the freakiest stuff happened. As soon as my dad starts to walk up towards the crawl space to check out what's inside, the door slams open. Let me be clear, there is no draft in my room. I had some tiny windows that I always kept shut because there weren't screens and bugs freaked me out. So in no way was there any kind of natural rhyme or reason for why my door randomly snapped closed the way it did. This didn't just scare the crap out of me either. My dad damn near screamed like a little girl. So we both kind of sit there in silence for a second, absorbing the situation. Then my dad decides enough is enough. He walks over to the crawl space door and starts tugging at it anyway. Watching all this happen from my bed, it was interesting. Like I had a bird's eye view of what was happening. That's how I saw what was about to happen next, without even trying. I watched him tugging at the door, yeah. But then, my bookshelf that's faced towards him in the crawl space starts going crazy, like there's an earthquake or something. A book flies off, just one, and that's enough to make me scream bloody murder. My dad, luckily quick, noticed me yelling and noticed the bookshelf in enough time to jump the hell out of the way. Good thing he did too, since directly afterwards all of the contents of the shelf began to fall with a large wooden structure. So my dad reassesses the situation. Obviously I didn't do that, and obviously that wasn't natural, and he later apologized pretty profusely about the whole thing, without ever being specific as to what he meant. I'm sorry I was acting strange, and I didn't mean to blame you for what was going on. He never directly used the word ghost, but they say kids sense these things. I was a kid, and I definitely sensed something or other. We ended up moving out of that place about a month after the bookshelf incident. For that last month, things kept being strange, but nothing as violent as that happened. Since then, I haven't felt or seen anything like it. So I wonder what everyone thinks of this entire situation. Hi, Donovan. I've been listening to your show for a while now, and I'm finally writing in with me and Goldie's story. It's just as much as her story as it is mine. See, Goldie is a golden retriever who's been with our family for over 5 years now, and she loves to go camping with us. I have a travel trailer that I use quite a bit. Almost every weekend in the summer, my son and my wife and I are camping at some campground. We live in Ohio, but we do go all over to camp. This one weekend in June, we didn't travel too far, and we camped at Mohican State Park. It was the second day that I was there. I was taking Goldie for a walk along the river trail. We had been walking for about 30 minutes when I heard something from off the trail come barreling through the woods. I thought it was a deer or possibly a black bear, but then it stops, like it must have caught wind of us or something. Goldie steps out in front of me and starts doing this low growl at the woods. She sensed that something was off right away, and the motion from this thing startled her at first. And I'm standing there and I can't see anything because the woods are pretty thick in that area. I started to pull at her lead, signaling to her that we need to turn around and go back, but she wouldn't budge. Then I start to hear this thing coming out of the woods. It's slowly making its way to the trail. I start yelling in case it's a bear, saying, "Get out of here, bear!" But what happened next shocked me to my core. I'm yelling and Goldie is there growling like I've never seen her before. She's such a mild-mannered dog and a total sweetheart. This monstrous, and I mean monstrous figure comes walking out of the woods making all kinds of noises while it's walking. Twigs and branches are snapping all over the place. It's covered in this long dark fur from head to toe, except for its face. And it stares right at me with its beady eyes and it raises its one hand. Now, I'm not sure what it was doing, but it put its arm over its head and it stood there making this grunting sound. Goldie at this point is going nuts. She's barking her head off, and it seems like this thing is annoyed at all the barking and starts to cover its ears. I'm trying to hold on to the lead as best as I can because Goldie just won't stop. This giant beast looks at Goldie and then turns and goes back into the woods. She wouldn't leave for another minute or so because I think she wanted to make sure the threat was gone. We eventually get back to camp, and I tell my wife and my kid about the entire experience. It was crazy to say the least. We ended up going home later that afternoon. I did tell one of the local rangers about the incident, but I think he just passed it off as a black bear. That thing was a Sasquatch. I have no doubt in my mind. And my sweet girl saved me from whatever that thing intended to do. I've been down on my luck plenty of times, and I've learned to never look down on people. I've been the guy on the side of the road with my thumb sticking out as cars drive on by. That's why I decided to stop that night, because I knew how he must have been feeling. I really wish I hadn't. I was on my way home from Harrisburg, heading back to Philly. I know most of the state like the back of my hand, having spent a few years as a short-range delivery driver. So when I hit the stalled traffic caused by all the road work, I knew what back streets and alternate routes I could turn to. It was one of those lesser-traveled roads that I encountered the man. He was slowly walking down the shoulder, thumb hung lazily in the air. At first, I drove past him, despite what I said about the looking down on people thing. I was a little bit hesitant to let somebody in my car right then. There really wasn't a whole lot around, and I couldn't imagine where he was heading to or coming from. But the angel on my shoulder won the battle, and after about a mile, I made a U-turn and I pulled up alongside him. I could see through my rolled-down window that he was a middle-aged guy, clean-shaven with his short cropped brown hair. He was wearing jeans and a denim jacket and had a thick rucksack flung over one shoulder. He was holding something small and flat in the crook of his elbow, but I couldn't make out what it was. He seemed alarmed when I first pulled up. I guess he wasn't really expecting anyone to pick him up from the side of the road. I introduced myself through the window and let him know which direction I was headed, and told him he could ride with me if he wanted to. He hesitated at first, but quickly decided that it beat walking alone on a dark road in the dead of night. He opened the door and climbed in. He introduced himself as Ken, and Ken smelled absolutely wretched. I wasn't sure how long he had been on the road, and knew that a few days without a shower can really do a number on anyone. Not wanting to make him feel self-conscious, I just kept the windows rolled down and made some small talk. He didn't really go into details on where he was going. He said that he had family in the Northeast, and that he had set out a few days ago to make the trek. I had known plenty of guys with hobo-ish tendencies, and even had some myself. Despite all the urban legends, they usually weren't that bad. Some were even a good time to be around. They just kind of lacked guidance and ambition. And talking to Ken, it seemed like he fell short on both. After about maybe a half hour of driving down the nearly deserted road, I asked him about the thing he was carrying. He had placed it on his lap and was covering it with his hands. He became uneasy, so I dropped it. At one point, though, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. Not a light, but rather a dark shape right behind the car. I asked Ken if he saw it. He said no, but when I peeked over at him, I could see that some of the color had drained from his face. I didn't see it again until we continued on in silence, until a short while later when I had to answer nature's call. I pulled over to the side of the road and told Kent that I would be right back. He was a nice enough guy, but I took the keys with me anyway. When I went to get out of the car, Ken grabbed me by the arm and asked me to please not take long. He wasn't rough, but something in his voice struck me as odd. It sounded like fear, almost panic even. I assured him I would be quick and walked about 30 yards away up to the tree line. I had just started to do my business when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something darting from the wood line towards my car. Whatever it was moving pretty fast. 2 more formless shadows followed it an instant later. Then another one on my left. This all happened in the span of about 2 seconds, and before I could zip up and turn around, I heard a scream from behind me coming from my car. I spun around and was caught with a bizarre spectacle. Those darting figures were now running in a full circle around my car. The shadows weren't anything material, and in fact, even seemed to grow and shrink in size and shape. Ken locked eyes with me through the open window, staring at me in dead silence. I had the keys in my pocket, and there was no way for him to roll it up. I was too in awe of what I was seeing to make any kind of rational decision. The forms just kept racing and racing around my car, a blur of erratic shapes. Suddenly, one of the shadows dove through the window, and Ken started screaming. He had been wearing a seatbelt, and I was close enough to hear his bones shattering. The blurred form seemed to have Ken by the legs and started dragging him across the road. All the other shapes now converged with the one carrying Ken. The thing underwent some kind of sick transformation, taking on the full mass of all the combined shadows. The end result was this massive creature, probably 12 feet, if not more. It had defined legs and arms now. One hand wrapped around Ken's legs. The head seemed to be in the shape of a bull, an immense rack of antlers crowning its head. The beast moved quickly into the forest on the far side of the road. I could hear Ken's screams for some time before they faded away. I was trying to contain my terror. I realized that my entire body was shaking so violently that I cracked a tooth. I stumbled over to my car, resting against the passenger side door, and trying to decipher what in the hell just happened. I happened to be looking down through the open window, and on the floor beneath, where Ked had been sitting, there was a book. There were strange symbols on the cover. One I recognized as a pentagram. I flipped through the book and felt bile start to rise in my throat. I couldn't understand any of the writing. It was in a language I had never seen before, and it certainly wasn't Latin. The sickening part was that the ink appeared to be dried blood in some parts. Other parts actually seemed to have been written with human fecal matter. I dropped the book to the ground and ran around to my driver's side door. Before I got in, though, I caught the sight of Ken's rucksack sitting in the back seat. With trepidation, I removed it and untied the flap. The bag was filled with the remains of, well, I don't know what. There were bones with meat and flesh still attached. And while I tried to tell myself that none of it was human, a part of me knew that it was. I threw the bag onto the grass as far as I could. I got in my car and drove full speed down the road, not looking back once. I never went to the police. What was I going to tell them? I picked up a hitchhiker, and a demon carried him off into the woods, and I threw out his bag of human remains. That was probably an easy way to end up on a watch list somewhere. No, I didn't do anything at all. Ken, or whoever he was obviously mixed up in some kind of dark and evil affair, one which I wanted no part of. Whatever it was that night, it left me well enough alone, and I plan on keeping that way. I'm only telling this story so it can serve as a warning. Be careful who you stop for when driving down dark and lonely roads. I was a teenager, and I was still in high school. Occasionally, my mom and I would drive around for hours to places that we didn't even know about, just aimlessly driving to some place that would get us away from everything. We found many cool areas doing this. Now, the reason for it wasn't very pleasant. I'd rather not go into details about it, but at least we have the memories we do. It was a particularly bad day. My mom picks me up from school. She got to leave work early, and she says that we were going for another drive. I never complained because I knew my mom was dealing with enough already, so I did everything I could to make her happy. That meant smiling and sucking it up. It also meant never complaining about spending too much time in the car. I did have siblings, but they were always with their friends. I had friends, but none that I really hung out with outside of school. I suppose I was more of a lone wolf than a social type. This meant that I was Mom's only company during the tougher days, and I knew how much that meant to her. It meant a lot to me, too. As we were driving, the sky gets pretty gray. It looked like we were going to be driving in the rain, and I was okay with that. My mom was driving some time before I realized that we were in the foothills, and from this area, we started heading up towards the mountains. We hadn't been to this area before. It was pretty cool. It was very green, and the road was full of all sorts of crazy twists and turns. My mom liked driving on roads like that. It made her feel invincible, I think. There's a point in time when we get to a flat area. I assumed it was the very top of this mountain. There's a road that leads straight ahead, but there's these weird gates. They sort of reminded me of those railroad gates that can open and close. They happened to be open. It looked really weird, but we were both very curious about it, so we went in. There were a few huge metal boxes that looked like transformers or something. I figured they were somehow connected to the gate that we drove through. All around us is this really cool wooded area. We followed the road for some time. Eventually, we hit a dead end. At the end of the road was this enormous body of water. It looked like a lake, but it seemed to turn into rivers that led off into two different directions. It seemed peaceful, and that's what my mom needed. We climbed out of the car and started to walk around this small area of land. If you were looking at the body of water from our car, there were different elements to notice. The first being that the area of land that we stood on obviously wrapped around the lake, but it was weird because we both couldn't walk on any of the sides. We were stuck in the dead center of the lake. This was partly due to the area on the left and the right of us being very steep and covered in rocks. There were two river-type things, as I mentioned, but they sort of swerved out to the northeast and northwest. It created this V-shape almost. And then, dead ahead of us was another area of land that was pretty far away from us. It was an interesting area for sure. I hadn't seen anything like it before. It was the most pure silence I've ever heard in my whole life. No cars, no background noise. But there weren't any other noises either, which made it kind of eerie. We were out in nature, but we couldn't hear any signs of it, like birds or crickets or any flying insects. It was dead quiet. It started to sprinkle the tiniest bit of rain, and even that sound seemed amplified. I remember my mom saying, "This is weird, huh?" It really was very weird, and I didn't think it could get much weirder, but it did. We looked out into the body of water and watched the small raindrops hitting the surface. The surface of the lake was super still, like freakily still. Like I've never seen water so still, not even in a bathtub. So that's what made what we saw much more horrifying. As we looked out towards this body of water, we saw something rather large splash the water upwards. The sound alone was enough to frighten me. A loud splash after hearing nothing for several minutes was quite shocking, but the enormity of whatever forced the water up was unexplainable. I don't think it could have been a fish. If it was, that fish was humongous. I hadn't noticed prior, but I noticed at this point that there was this weird series of smaller objects sitting above the water off to my left. They almost looked like a row of rocks peeking out of the water. It must have not caught my eye before, being that the sides were pretty much covered by large rocks. But as soon as we saw that splash and the gigantic ripples it created in the lake, I started to wonder if those rocks weren't really rocks at all, but the back of something large hidden under the water. All of this observation took no time at all, and if I'm being truthful, I was much too frightened to stand there much longer. My mom started to usher me into the car, saying that we needed to leave. So we got into the car and left. I would have thought that my mind was playing tricks on me. All of what we had experienced was truly, for lack of better words, creepy. And my mom started revisiting the events out loud as we drove. Everything she was saying was exactly what I saw, too. I can still hear her words. That wasn't a fish. It couldn't have been, right? All I know is whatever it was made me so scared. I wouldn't step foot near another lake or river again. I just won't. For the better part of my 20s, I lived deep in the forests of Washington, between the lush woods and the lively coast to the west. Each year, it feels as though dozens of local homes come forward with some tale about a cryptid encounter. And as I'm sure you know, anytime someone encounters a cryptid, they simultaneously forget how to work a camera. But real or not real, cryptids are an interesting personality trait of Washington, and one of the main reasons I haven't moved closer to the city of Seattle, which I dearly love. Each Thursday evening, I find myself excited to attend the Cryptid Council. It's a weekly meeting where individuals come together to share their experiences. Every so often, we plan trips to locations of recent sightings. One particular Thursday, the day before Halloween actually, an elderly woman attended our meeting in shambles after claiming to have encountered a Sasquatch-like figure just hours before that afternoon. You should have seen the way we, my friends in the council and I, sprung to our feet. Never had an encounter been reported to the group so quickly, and it just so happened we were itching to have an outing over the holiday weekend. In no time, we made the executive decision to call off work the following day, and to scramble home and pack our bags and head out before it got too dark. Our destination, really just an extension of this woman's backyard, was about 40 minutes away from my house. So, by the time we had made it to the woods and set up our camping equipment, The sun was nearly set. Now, by no means were any of us jumping at the opportunity to take part in a camping trip where we actually thought something scary would show face. After all, nothing like that had ever happened before. So, what gave us the reason to believe it would now? It was more so an excuse for the four of us guys to eat junk food, drink cheap whiskey out of flasks, and to tell ghost stories around a portable fire pit. A boys' weekend, if you will. So, as you can imagine, come about 2 a.m., we were all awoken by the most guttural yelping we've ever heard. We were taken aback. In situations like that, you don't spend a significant amount of time being groggy and waking up. It's like your instincts shoot along your spine, and we were all immediately on high alert. Tony was the first to say what we were all thinking when he asked, "What the hell was that?" Standing up from the ground, a wind caught my nose, carrying with it the most foul stench of urine and BO. I quickly assessed our immediate surroundings, and having not seen anything, made quick work of smothering the remaining ashes of our fire as to minimize our visibility. Before any of us had the opportunity to ask anything else, or conjure up a possible response to Tony's question, a series of deafening whooping noises filled the air, chilling us to the bone. Charlie was the first of the group to sprint away, and none of us had to say a word. We were all right behind him, with no hesitation. After about 30 seconds of running, we came barreling into the back door of the elderly woman's home, who'd left the door unlocked in case we needed to use the restroom in the middle of the night. We quickly locked the door, pulled the blinds, and each staged ourselves at the various windows lining the backside of the house to peek outside. When the woman appeared at the top of the stairs, asking us what was going on, we quickly hushed her and turned our attention back to the outdoors. And that's when it stepped into view, emerging like a giant, even amongst the towering trees surrounding it. This thing must have been every bit of 11 feet tall, with dark brown fur covering it from head to toe, minus its bare face. It walked on 2 legs, almost like an ape, but there was something humanoid about it too, like Neanderthal, with beady eyes and a projecting mouth. We were all frozen in place, and didn't dare to make a sound from within the house. I was certain that if we did, and this thing wanted to, it would have easily busted through the back door. Realistically, it must have stalked around the backyard for only a minute or so before vanishing into the woods from which it came. But truth be told, it felt like an eternity watching it. At the first sign of the coast being clear, we all huddled upstairs as to make the least noise possible and called 911. When the cops arrived, we were cleared to evacuate the property. The woman was taken to a local motel for the foreseeable few nights, and the boys and I packed back into my Jeep and hightailed it back to my house, a much safer 40 minutes away. The police never got back in contact with any of us after that night, leaving my friends and I to believe that nothing was uncovered regarding whatever it was we saw in that backyard. But after that, we never participated in a cryptid council outing again. Of course, the group ragged on us for returning with a hell of a story but no picture to support our case, but we didn't even care. We all knew what we saw that night, even if it's not something we could explain away with words. And that in itself was enough for us all to decide to eat junk food and drink cheap whiskey from the comfort of our own homes from then on. Traveling has always been one of my passions. I have one of those maps of the United States, where you fill it in with pictures from each state, and the state's shape and everything like that. I have traveled to probably a third of the country, and I have stories from every state, but none beat the story of my last trip to West Virginia. This story sounds crazy, and I understand if you think I'm making it up. Everyone I've told thinks that. You read listeners' stories though, so I'm pretty sure you won't think I'm crazy. At least that's what I'm hoping for. I want this story heard because maybe it will help someone else who needs to hear that they aren't alone, that someone else has seen whatever this thing was. I always drive when I travel because that's half of the adventure. I had been on the road for a while. Driving from Oklahoma to West Virginia is about a 15-hour drive with no traffic, so I stopped off for the night at a hotel. This allowed me to pick up a postcard to mail home along the way, another little tradition that I like to do when I travel through a state. I know that the next thing I tell you is when you're going to think I'm crazy. I was a few miles outside of Point Pleasant. I had stayed longer in Mount Vernon, Illinois than I had intended, so it was just around dusk as I was traveling eastbound. My destination was within 20 miles. I was jamming out to some old classic country, belting out George Strait, when something caught my eye. I slowed down and rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I was really struggling to understand what was happening, because I had just seen a huge gray man with wings spanned at least 10 feet, flying right next to my car. I shook my head and pulled over. Maybe I was just too tired. I sat in my car and decided maybe I needed a short nap. I set a timer on my phone to wake me in 15 minutes, but I couldn't go to sleep. I closed my eyes and immediately I could see the creature in my mind. I finally gave up and decided to finish heading into town. I pulled back onto the road and had barely rounded a curve when a hunched over figure appeared in a field directly in front of me. The thing was huge. When I first saw it, I swear it had red eyes, but as my headlights hit its face, the eyes reflected back at me. I slammed on my brakes. I was so freaked out. I really didn't understand what was going on. I watched this thing watch me. Eventually, it shifted, turning its gaze elsewhere and kinda shuffling away. So I started to continue my trip. It wasn't long before new motion out of my side window caught my eye. I gasped and hit the gas. The thing was following me. It ran like a kid who was just learning to run, all awkward and unsure. But when it opened its wings and took to the sky, I couldn't outrun it. I sped up, nearing 80 miles per hour, but it still kept up, its red eyes staring at me the whole time. So I increased my speed again. Now I'm going at least 90 miles an hour as I desperately try to outrun this thing. I was beginning to panic. I had no idea what was going on or what this thing was, but I wanted far away from it. Whatever it was never stopped following me, not until I hit the outskirts of the town. As I started to pass houses, it slowly fell behind, still watching me. I could see its red eyes in my rearview mirror. The sight was enough to leave me shaken to my core. As I reached town, my grip on the steering wheel loosened. I laughed out loud. I seriously have one heck of an imagination, but I was not ready for what was coming next. I was checking into the hotel. The clerk was being nice and was making small talk, and I'm sure I looked terrified and crazy, but she kept chatting away. She gave me my room number and my key card, and as I said thank you, she asked if I was traveling alone. When I said yes, she asked me if I was okay. I looked like I was running from something. I didn't think I should tell her what I saw, so I just told her that I had an odd experience on the highway heading in, and was ready to turn in for the night. She nodded, and I headed to my room. I laid in that bed for hours, trying to justify the creature, until my hunger got the best of me and I decided to find a fast food place to grab a quick bite to eat. I was pulling into the drive-thru when the red eyes appeared again. I screamed. I couldn't help it. I was so exhausted and I just didn't have it in me to keep acting like things didn't faze me. I wasn't alone this time though. The car ahead of me started honking, and the passenger was excitedly pointing ahead of us in the same direction. They didn't seem overly afraid though. At least I'm not the only one who can see whatever this is, was all I could think. I'd completely lost my appetite though. I headed back to the hotel, pulled the blanket over my head, and prayed for morning. I tried talking to my family about this when I got home, but they told me that my stories just get more and more creative. I gave up eventually, but I do need someone to tell me if they have seen the same thing. Hey Donovan, I hope you decide to read this. I think your listeners will really enjoy hearing about this, and it will help me process everything that has happened while we lived in this house. My dad was military, so we moved around a lot. Like, a lot. It seemed like every 4 years we were getting stationed in another state. We had just been stationed in Colorado Springs, and I was seriously excited. I had missed the snow after being in Texas for the last 4 years. The house that my parents rented for us seemed pretty nice. It was really big, had more than enough rooms, and it even had an awesome basement. I was really excited about the basement. Having a room that was underground and pretty much soundproof from the outside seemed perfect. We had only been there for a couple of weeks, and we were all settling in pretty quickly. We were so used to moving that it no longer was a big deal. I had just finished setting up my drums in the basement and was about to get the amp for my guitar plugged in and everything would be perfect. Things were coming along nicely, and I was very happy that my parents were letting me make this area mine. I hadn't been able to really play in a while. I sat back on the couch that they bought for me and strummed a little, testing the sound and ensuring I had it all tuned up and the amp dialed in just right. Suddenly, the room got colder. It didn't really faze me though. This wasn't my first rodeo with a cold state. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and played my favorite song by memory. Having my own musical space away from my little brother was honestly perfect. No one could touch my stuff or mess with my settings. The peaceful feeling didn't last long though. I was just hitting the second bridge when I heard it. It sounded like nails on a chalkboard and gave me goosebumps. I hate that sound. I opened my eyes and looked around wildly, trying to understand where it was coming from. That's when the lights started flickering. But this house was pretty old, so maybe the wiring was janky. I decided to head upstairs. Maybe my parents could contact the landlord and have someone come check out this wiring for us. I had made it about halfway up the stairs when the door slammed shut. I stopped in my tracks and stared at the door. What on earth is going on? I ran up the last of the stairs and tried to open the door. It wouldn't budge. Panic was taking over and I started banging on it. I was legitimately terrified. I screamed for my mom and my dad, even my brother, but no one was responding. I started trying to rationalize what was happening. If no one was answering, maybe they were playing a prank on me. Using this logic, I calmed down and went back downstairs. If they wanted to scare me, I wasn't going to act like nothing was going on. I had just started playing again when I started to feel the couch shift. I tried to ignore it though. I was trying to keep my cool. I didn't need to panic when I was stuck in a room and couldn't escape. But soon the movements got harsher. It was definitely jerking around. I pulled my feet up on the couch and grabbed the arm, trying to keep myself from getting hurt while whatever was happening. I knew this wasn't a prank, but what could I do? The door was jammed and I couldn't get out. So I started to try to talk to whatever was doing this. I told them that I meant no harm, and I asked them to please let me out. I only made them angrier. The movements got a lot more forceful, and the lights started cutting out. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The sound was back and 10 times louder. It was so loud that my head was starting to hurt. I was officially terrified and didn't know how to get this to stop. The lights started to stay off for longer periods. On, off for 30 seconds, on, off for 30 seconds, and over. Soon the couch stopped getting jerked around, but I kept my feet up. I was hopeful that whatever was happening was almost over. I was so wrong. The next time the lights went out, there was this low growl. And when they came on, there, standing about 10 feet in front of me, was a teenage girl, probably about 16. She was like a mist, though. I could literally see my drums through her, but what really scared me was her eyes. They were like empty holes, pitch black and non-existent, and the blood drenching the front of her clothes. At that point, I screamed, but I think that just made her angry. She turned her eyeless face towards me, and the couch lifted in the air 3 feet before crashing down again. I was begging her to stop. She cocked her head at me, and this time when the couch lifted, it stayed. I was floating 3 feet off the ground watching this thing look at me without any eyes. She straightened her head before throwing it back. Across her throat was this huge cut. I screamed out again and grabbed the couch as it fell. The lights began to flicker again, as if I needed any help being more afraid. She was still there, watching me, until the 4th or 5th time the lights flashed. This time when they came on, she was gone. The door flew open and the room returned to normal temperature. I looked around the room, trying to make sure that I was really alone before standing up. I had never ran so fast up the stairs in my life. My parents still don't believe me. No one heard me screaming or begging for help. I never stepped foot down in the basement again. Hey there, Donovan. I'm writing to you from Southern PA with an experience I had this fall. I think it's right up your alley. So, I'm an events coordinator and I usually work with local farms. I help them organize birthday parties, hay rides, and stuff like that. It's a pretty neat job. And I get to bring my family along to most of the public events at a discount. This fall, I took my parents to the annual apple picking bash at one of our bigger farms. They were only in town for the weekend, and I figured it would be a nice way to relax. We were in the orchard, collecting our apples and everything, when this terrible smell hit me. It's hard to describe, but it was this acidic metallic reek, and it was overwhelming. It happened so suddenly that it made my eyes water. The smell was so overpowering that it felt like it had knocked the wind out of me. I had to sit down for a second. My parents were fine and my mom asked me what was wrong. I couldn't explain it. I just felt really clammy and cold. It was hard to think. We were a little ways from the other customers. My mom ran off to get me some water while my dad stayed with me. I think we were both worried I was going to faint. My dad and I were uphill, so we could see over the rest of the orchard. And I realized that it had gotten quiet. When we looked down at the other customers, it looked like everyone had stopped moving. A lot of people were sitting down like I was, or just completely laid down on the ground. It was like we had all collapsed at the same time. I started to get really dizzy. Then my dad went down. I felt too weak to help him up. All I could do was wait it out and hope that my mom was okay. It felt like I was going to pass out at any moment. I don't know how long it lasted, but then the smell was gone. It got easier to breathe and I felt less shaky. I helped my dad up. Whatever happened seemed like it had been worse for him than it was for me. When we looked down at the orchard, we saw other people starting to move and help each other up. Whatever had affected us seemed to leave all at once. My dad and I stumbled down the hill. My mom hadn't made it very far. We found her leaning against a tree trying to catch her breath. I was worried because she had pretty bad asthma, but she seemed to be doing okay. All of us were just happy to be safe. My dad wanted to get out of the orchard as quickly as possible. The other customers had the same idea. There was this mad dash to get to the parking lot. Just a surge of freaked out people all trying to get out at once. My parents and I actually had to stay in the orchard even longer because of the crowd. By the time we finally got to our car, we were able to get on the highway. It was pretty dark out by then. I was a little nervous about driving so soon after that dizzy spell, but I didn't have much of a choice. Now, this particular orchard was about 30 miles out from my suburb. It was a little remote, and we had to travel on a few back roads before we could reach the highway. A lot of the other people were headed in that same direction, so at first I was just following the other cars. But then traffic stopped. We were stuck in the same spot for almost 20 minutes. People started getting out of their cars to walk to the front to see what was going on. Maybe a tree had fallen into the road or something. After walking for a while, I saw what was wrong. There was a barricade of police cruisers blocking the road. And not just cruisers. They had those big tank-looking vehicles, you know? The ones they'll sometimes pull out for a riot. They weren't letting anyone pass, but the police officers stayed behind the barricade. No one even came out to talk to us or direct traffic toward a different route. We were just stuck there. I asked a guy in front of me if the officers had communicated at all. He said no. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I just headed back to my car. And I gotta tell you, the longer I walked, the more freaked out I became. I had a feeling something really bad was going to happen. Or something bad already happened, and now they're just out here to clean up the loose ends. When I told my parents what I had seen, they didn't know what to do either. So we were just all waiting there, in the dark, hoping the officers would eventually get fed up and let us pass. And I guess they did. It took a while, but eventually the traffic started to move. I didn't know what changed until we got closer to the front. We each had to get out of the car, and we were asked questions by this doctor. And they split us up. I had to talk to a physician local to the area. My mom said she got interviewed by an army nurse. It took forever, and the questions were really specific. I had to remember my entire medical history on the spot. I was scared to forget anything because I didn't know what would make them keep us there longer. Eventually, they let us pass. The drive back to my house should have only taken about an hour. Instead, it was closer to 3. And by the time we got home, we were completely exhausted. No one ever came to talk to us about that mass collapse at the orchard. I don't really know what to do with this story. I feel fine, like my body didn't get affected too badly. But I think we all took part in some sort of experiment. I truly believe that. Growing up in Appalachia, you always hear stories, but you brush them off. However, the warnings that came with the stories, yeah, those you listen to. Don't whistle after dark. If you hear something saying your name, no you don't. Never run in the woods. I can go on, but these are the important ones. I had always thought these were jokes, just some old wives' tales that our moms passed down to make us listen. But that all changed a few years ago, and now I tell these warnings to everyone that says they're coming to visit. It was just another day out in the trails. I had ridden them probably 1,000 times in my life. I was checking out the fence line because we had a cow come up missing. I had been out for a few hours, but hadn't seen anywhere that the heifer could have crossed the fence. I turned my horse around and headed back. But then I heard it. I heard my name. I stopped my mare and looked over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I just kind of shrugged it off. I figured my sister was trying to play a prank on me. I would head back to the house and let Mom know that she was out there goofing off. But then I heard it again. I turned around my saddle and scanned the tree line, but I still couldn't see anyone. Sis was always afraid of the woods, so I knew that she wouldn't be further than the first trees, but I couldn't see her at all. I was starting to feel a little uneasy, so I loosened the reins and headed back again. This time when I heard my name, it was screamed. I was instantly covered in goosebumps. It sounded just like my sister, and she sounded scared. Instead of listening to my gut that was telling me to get out of there, I turned my horse around and headed to the woods. But she started tossing her head and sidestepping. She was not having any of it. I tried to calm her down, but she started to panic more. I decided that I would tie her off on a fence post and go check it out on foot. I started towards the trees. Looking back, I don't know what I was thinking, but at the time, I was trying to help my sister. It didn't take long to cross a small field and enter the woods. I started looking for her immediately, but I saw no sign of her. After a few minutes, I was ready to head back to the house, but as I started to head back to the trail on my horse, I heard the scream again. Further into the forest, I took off running, calling her name. She didn't respond, but I just kept running. I knew she was here somewhere, and this far in, she may be lost. My parents wouldn't be happy if I left her out here. I had to find her. I kept running and calling for her, but she wasn't answering. After calling out a few more times, I stopped running. I realized that I was pretty far past any point I could remember. I started trying to trace my steps back and quickly realized that I was lost. I can remember this cold hitting me as I realized that I had no idea which way led back to the trail. It wasn't long before I heard my name again, only this time it was closer, and almost a whisper. I spun around looking frantically. The voice was wrong. It sounded like my sister, but it definitely wasn't her voice that I was hearing. I could hear something moving just out of my sight, and my hair stood on end. It didn't take long for me to make out the creature that was watching me. I heard my name again and looked right where it came from. I could make out this human shape, but it was all wrong. It was on all fours, kind of hunched over. It had a pelt of some type and an animal skull over its head. But the eyes were wrong. They were too human to be an animal. I screamed, and it smiled, lunging towards me. I turned and ran like my life depended on it, because as far as I was concerned, it did. This thing was fast, and I knew it was toying with me. I was panting and my body burned, but I wasn't stopping. Finally, I saw the trees thinning out in front of me, and I wasted no time in making it out of the trees. I could hear whatever it was calling my name from the tree line as I hurried to untie my horse. I ignored the calls and threw myself into the saddle. My mare needed absolutely no encouragement to get out of there. We were soon racing down the trail, as whatever it was followed us in the trees. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty as we rounded the corner and the house was visible. We didn't stop running. My mare was wide-eyed and terrified. I couldn't blame her. I knew that whatever it was had just followed us home. I rushed to my dad and told him what had happened, yelling for him to get his gun. He looked startled at first, but when he saw how scared I was, he met me at the gate, opening it quickly with his shotgun in hand. Whatever it was chasing me, it stayed in the trees. Dad shook his head as I told him what had happened. He knew that I knew better. I had been warned my whole life, but I didn't believe the warnings or the stories. After that, no one was allowed to check on the fence alone. We had to go in pairs. Don't be like me. Pay attention. These warnings may just save your life. Hi, Donovan. I've been looking for other people who might believe what I'm talking about. There are groups on the internet, and I've talked with people, but honestly, it all sounds made up to me, which doesn't help my confidence when I share this. But I think this is the place to tell my story. My wife had been bugging me for a few weeks. She asked me to set up security cameras on the perimeter of her home. She wanted a camera set up over the garage, too. A few random things had been happening around our house for a couple of weeks, and my wife was pretty concerned. There were several nights when our trash can was moved. It was never knocked over or spilled, but it was moved across the yard. We have a fence and a gate that locks on the outside of our house. 3 nights in a row, the lock was unfastened and the gate was open. My wife saw our dog in the front yard. I tried to tell her it was just neighborhood kids, but she persisted that it wasn't. So I went out and I spent a bunch of money and bought all these security cameras. I work long days, so it took a lot of coffee to get acclimated to staying awake and watching the cameras. The first couple nights, nothing happened. I was beginning to think my wife was going crazy. Maybe she needed more sleep. I was trying not to doze off on the 4th night. It was a Saturday. It was late, and I was awake because I didn't have to be at work early the next morning. First, I saw the camera in front of the garage blink out, and it went white for maybe a half a second. When the picture came back, our trash can was moved to the other side of the driveway. The camera on the side of the house turned off on its own. It just went black. I rewound the tape but saw the exact same thing I saw the first time. Just white for a flash. I went outside to check it out. It was quiet out, which is totally normal at 2 a.m. where I live. It's a pretty quiet neighborhood. I saw nothing out of place, except for that trash can. I grabbed the handle of the trash can to drag it back to where it belongs, and pulled, but it didn't budge. I couldn't move the darn thing. It felt like it weighed a literal ton. I leaned back and pulled it with both hands. That thing wasn't moving. I stood there dumbfounded. The overhead lights on the garage flickered. I tried lifting the lid off the trash can, just to do something. It was stuck. The trash can was completely immovable. The lights flickered again and turned off. Everything went black. I heard a loud buzzing for a second, and the lights flickered back to life. The trash can had moved again. Now it was near the curb. I started freaking out. This whole thing was way too weird. I ran back inside the house and locked the door. I watched the yard through the window for maybe about an hour, and nothing happened at all. I sat in front of the computer screen and watched the cameras. I was buzzing. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to see. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I wasn't sure what could possibly be going on. The camera on the side of the house was still black. I kept glancing at it anyway, then it turned on. The gate was open, and I saw my dog standing there. I forgot that I had let him out just a few minutes earlier. He was looking at something. I saw him raise his hackles like he was scared. Then both cameras turned off again, and the screens were dead. I got up and ran to the garage and opened the automatic door. My dog heard and ran to me. He was whimpering and his tail was between his legs. I was patting him on the head when I saw something move alongside the front yard. It was smallish and fast. For a second, I thought it was a cat or something, but it couldn't be. It had pale skin. I only saw it for a second, but I was sure. My dog whimpered and bolted in the house. The lights above the garage flickered again. I flipped on the switch to the lights inside the garage, but they didn't respond, and it went dark again. That buzzing sound returned and changed into this low hum. My eyes were adjusting to the dark, and I saw something in the shadows near the street. It was a short, pale kid. That's what I thought at first as it started moving towards me. I saw that its head was bulbous. It was too big to be a kid. It opened its eyes and revealed these large black orbs, and it blinked several times. The lights flickered again, and when they turned off, I heard this squealing noise, like someone was burning rubber in their car, but there was no smell. Right as the lights came back on, I saw my trash can pop up and then blast straight into the air, and the whole thing was completely silent. I ran into the driveway and looked up, but the trash can was gone. It disappeared. And so did the little person or whatever it was that I saw. I just stood there and looked up at the sky for a long time. I locked the side gate, and even though it felt completely pointless, I went inside and I checked the cameras. I saw nothing in the side yard camera. It had blacked out, but the camera in the front of the garage was working. I rewound the footage. The trash can was sitting there. The lights above the garage flickered, and the screen went white, and when it came back, I was standing in the driveway, and the trash can was gone. I kept rewatching it over and over, looking for anything, a pale person or those giant black eyes, but there was nothing there. My wife was right to suspect something, but I still don't know how to explain any of it.